of the world, another beautiful day in paradise. I believe we just agreed that you had to actually do something while we introduced. So I was supposed to filibuster so you could finish your preparation, and then I threw to you. So I very rudely threw you under the bus. I'll give you another 1 minute while I tell everyone the usual introductory stuff. Taxpayers.org.au. That's the Australian Taxpayers Alliance that helps us to put this on. Go check it out. See what campaigns we're up to. Join if you like it. Throw us a penny if you want. And we simulcast this. This is going live to X. I'm finally getting used to calling it X, to YouTube and to Facebook. On YouTube and Facebook, it's on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance channel. Wherever you're looking at it, please give us a like, give it a share, spread it around the algorithm. This is going out live, so let's get that going. And also give us a follow if you're not already on those platforms. You can also find in the information notes below how to follow Gene and myself on X. Gene, and I believe you may be sharing it somewhere as well. I'm not sure.
Yes, I just shared it via my small YouTube channel. But I see as of now, all the views are coming from your X and the ATA YouTube. But anyway,
don't tell anyone. It's all a secret. You keep it all a mystery. That way, no one ever. We've got complete deniability later.
Yeah.
So we do take chats. This is live, so feel free to write in your comments, questions, criticisms. Throw a tomato. Tell us how right we are about everything, and then we will agree with you, agreeing with us, agreeing with you, or totally disagree. That's fine too. I mean, it's worth having the discussion, worth having the argument. If you're particularly passionate about it, we could, and nuanced and intelligent, we could invite you on, and you can come on the stage and tell us to our face how wrong we are. Otherwise, we'll just read your chats. So yeah, feel free to get involved. Having said all that, now I believe we've taken it as accustomed to throwing up Gene's your slides. Have we come up with a name? I think we did, and I forget it every week, and then I ask the same question every week. Gene's roundup, Gene's slides, but either way, I think over to you, Gene.
Yes, yeah, thanks, John. I thought I'd start off with just some reflections on the Concilium event. I attended the CIS Centre for Independent Studies Concilium event over Friday or Thursday through to Saturday. That was at the Gold Coast, the Langham, and I was lucky enough to be on a very interesting panel discussion with Peter Costello, former treasurer, and Michael Stutchbury, who's the executive director of CIS, and Emma Dawson from Per Capita. So that was on productivity. So we kicked off with productivity, and there was a lot of discussion about that. And I mean, as we've talked about that a lot on our show already, and the issues with productivity, issues with regulation, and the growth of government, and just the high level of taxes and what that means for efficiency. So we had industrial relations too. So we covered a lot of that ground. What I found fascinating about the Concilium, and I know we're going to talk about it tonight, is that there ended up being this big debate, and I can't go into who said what because it's Chatham House rule, but I can give the flavour of it. There was a big debate about what's the appropriate stance or policy views of an organisation like CIS, which is, I mean, I don't know how much these labels matter anymore or mean anything, but CIS is nominally or notionally centre-right, and traditionally belief in free markets and liberty. But as one of the speakers, or someone who was at not no one on that stage, but as someone who was at the event noted, isn't that all very 2015, or isn't it all passé now? Because now there are concerns about economic resilience, national security. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that view that we should just throw out all of those beliefs in free trade, but it's becoming there's this tension now between an interventionist approach trying to promote manufacturing because of concerns over resilience and national security, concerns over what China intends in the region, and that is coming up against this belief in free trade, the belief in a non-interventionist industry policy, laissez-faire, that I think CIS is traditionally believed in. And so this is becoming a real tension in what you could broadly describe as the centre right. So that was a really big theme of the concilium. So I thought that was rather interesting, and it just goes to, that there's this big issue about, how do classical liberals, how do people who believe in free markets and liberty think about these issues. So that's probably the first thing I thought we should talk about tonight, John, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, just before we get to either of our thoughts, I mean, this really kicked off on the centre-right political space a couple of weeks ago when Hastie put out his now quite famous short video where he was talking about how Australia needs to make things again, and he's standing there next to an old Commodore. I can't remember which car it was, but he's standing there next to some 1970s made in Australia car saying, we used to make things, we should make things again, or something along those lines. And that really kicked off. And then you saw like Judith Sloan and Simon Cohen and a few other people pushing back against that through op-eds, through the I think it was through the Oz. But and that kind of showed this festering tension that I think is on the right. And I'd put this down to, I think there's a broader issue here. You're seeing this around the world, right? And much more acutely overseas than in Australia. So it's still quite new in Australia, but we're seeing a fight for the soul of the centre right, an internal fight just on the right of politics of what the right is going to look like going forward, right? Something's changing, right? So the first thing is you've got the establishment, right? And then you've got, it looks like something's changing. And I think there's a lot to be said that's true, but to what? It's not clear what it's changing towards yet. And that's true in America as well. There's battles inside America of, it's changing, but changing to what? And I think we're starting to see that in Australia. So I think a lot of people have been very much looking forward to having that debate. They feel like it's been sort of stifled by establishment boffins. And now the debate is finally getting out there. And so Hastie is getting some credit for kickstarting that debate. Interestingly, though, then he's done it by effectively pushing old school industry policy, which maybe then gets us into what we actually think of that. So I want to put out a few instinctive reactions, and very keen to hear your pushback or your take on any of them. One reaction, which is not economic first, is Hastie's reaction and the people saying, make things in Australia again. Let's follow Trump's policies. Let's put up protection and bring back the car industry and things like that. I think that is good politics. I think it is probably not very good economics, but I think given that there is a fight going on for the soul of the right, it is relevant to know, I think it'll play well. So this is probably something we're going to have to sort of address head on. We can't take the old school approach of just waving your hands and saying, oh, well, that's silly. That's not what Howard did. Or in America saying, that's not what Reagan did, and then dismissing it. I think it'll play well. I think there is a pitch on the right that says we need to give up on teal seats. Not everyone on the right thinks this, but as I say, there's a civil war on the right. But the pitch is basically give up on the teal seats, go after the working class seats, the outer suburban seats that used to have a lot of blue collar workers that instinctively voted for Labor and are drifting away, Howard Battlers, Tony's tradies, or whatever they were called, Reagan's Democrats in America. And to pitch for those people, you can't stick to your traditional cliche centre-right economics. What you need to do is tap into stuff that actually hits people on the sort of pro-union funny bone, political funny bone. And so I think that's one part of the potential political smarts here. It's saying, well, let's make friends with those blue-collar workers again. They've lost their jobs. They want their jobs back. Let's help get them their jobs back. Let's bring industry back to the country. Unions tend to like that sort of pro-industry policy that sort of gets more what they hope, the sort of jobs that they'd be representing, and gives subsidies to the businesses they're in, because who doesn't like subsidies? I mean, that's a pretty universal thing. And I think it also just pitches to, I think this policy works well politically because I think there's an instinctive positive reaction by what I hesitate to call the Wenwees. The Wenwees is a term as I understand it. So correct me if I'm wrong, people listening at home. I'm not quite old enough to have remembered the country my parents came from. My parents grew up in the country that was then called Rhodesia. They left before I was born, but we went back several times, and you always hear the stories. And there's apparently a category of Rhodesians, sort of the white Zimbabweans who left the country. There's a category of Rhodesians who get together, and all of their conversations revert back to when we were back there, when we did this, and they apparently have this little title of the when we's, because they just became people who lived their life in the past of back when it was good, and it's not good now. And I don't mean to be throwing shade if you're sitting at home and you're one of those people. I mean, this is just a story I heard, but that name, when we's, perhaps also could describe a bit of an instinct people have about back when Australia was better and when we had things. And I think this sort of policy plays politically well because it hits that political funny bone. It's like, let's go back to when it was good like that. When we had, stronger communities, when we had better jobs and job security, when we sort of made things that you could point at in this country and be proud of. And I think it works politically. So to the people who disagree, and I probably disagree. We'll get to the second point of what exactly does he mean. But it's going to be tricky because I think they have the political winds at their back. This hasty mob, I don't know what to call them yet, because painted against this sort of when we were great nostalgia and this politically sensible tack towards the outer suburban working class, which that there's a lot to be said for that. Painted against that, we look the sort of nerdy, Poindexter insider establishment people reciting the same thing that everybody's heard for the last couple of decades, and everyone kind of feels like things aren't going well for the last couple of decades. You guys are reciting the same stuff with your nerdy graphs. I mean, that's a tricky hand to play if you're playing poker. So it is incumbent upon us, if we disagree with this sort of protectionist industrial policy, we're going to have to think carefully about the politics there, because I think politically they have 4 aces, and we're sitting there with 7-2 offsuit. So I know I'm mixing up my purposes, but you get the idea. So what do you make of that, Gene? The political side?
Well, I mean, I think we're looking back on it with rose-colored glasses, aren't we, really? Because this is a point that, you wouldn't expect this, but this came up in a presentation that Warwick McKibben gave. So Warwick gave a presentation. So Warwick McKibben, eminent macroeconomist, built a model with Jeffrey Sachs of the global economy, and for the last 40 years has been developing this model. And so whenever there's a new trade policy that comes out, Warwick can run some simulations and tell some really fascinating story about how it's all going to impact, and really trace out the linkages. And I mean, Warwick's view is, I mean, he argues, well, this is negative for the US, probably won't impact us very much, and if anything, actually could be positive because we get all of these cheaper goods that aren't being sold into the US market. They get diverted to other markets. But this came up in Warwick's after Warwick presented, and then this is when someone, I won't name names, but someone who's sort of in a commentator or a consultant, someone who's sort of involved, does a lot of consulting, sort of said, "Oh, well, hang on, isn't this really passé now? Because we're all now worried about economic resilience, security, etc." And then someone else who's quite well known goes, "Oh, look, they were backing the hasty view and saying, look, we just want to feel pride in what we're building. We don't care if it costs a little bit more or if our GDP is a little bit lower." So essentially, they're making this trade-off. They actually see there is this. It's not about economics. It is about either national security, although I think that's a bit ill-defined, or it's about national pride. And one thing, and I thought one of the interesting exchanges was when one of the commentators says, "Oh yes, I mean, we really need to have our own car industry again. We should be, having Aussie cars." And then Warwick said, "Well, the problem was Warwick says something along these lines: you didn't buy the cars when we were producing them, and that was the problem. We were producing cars, and we weren't, they weren't competitive with the cheaper imports, which are often of higher quality. That was the fundamental problem, that our car industry just wasn't competitive without tariffs."
I don't know enough about car quality to be able to comment on that part, but I think one thing to note there is the issue was in Australia, I believe we were just overwhelmingly making sedans. And if anyone goes outside and looks around the roads these days, you'll find a bunch of hatches and a bunch of SUVs. And I was trying to tell my kids what a sedan was, and we were just driving down the highway, and it took us a while until we passed one. And then it was like we've started this game of spot the sedans so that they could learn. At the age of 4, 5, and 6, they spotted their first sedan in the wild. So it's just, even if we made good sedans, the issue is,
true. Yeah, I should retract that a bit. I mean, I do think we did make some quality cars, so I wouldn't want to be too negative about that. But yeah, certainly, I mean, there was a switch away from them, and we were buying other cars, and the industry was only really competitive, or it could compete with those imports when the tariffs were high and they were at that disadvantage. And as they started reducing those tariffs, and those imports became cheaper, then it was really very difficult for our domestic car industry to survive.
Yes, without massive subsidies, which they got for a while, but then that becomes it. So that takes me to, so politically, I think, I mean, that's anecdotal for what you were saying, anecdotally in support of what I'm saying. The political wins are in the sails of the people who say, let's take this approach. So that's the first thing. The first thing I do is frame us as the underdogs. Very smart. But I also think that's accurate there. We are in this instance, if we're pushing back the underdogs. Secondly, I'd say to this is, if what Hastie is saying, and it's like he hasn't given a full magnus opus, right? He hasn't given a full thesis on this. It's just a short advert, and you've got to give some leeway for people just speaking poetically in a political advert. But if what he's saying is he has an aspiration for Australia to have more manufacturing, and perhaps for part of the reason there is that we have for pride, part for security reasons, and who knows what if there's other reasons you want to throw in there. For jobs, I guess. The issue then is if that's the goal, it's an aspiration. I don't see too much to disagree with there. I think the issue is the rubber hits the road is saying, all right, well, what's your actual policy to get us from here to there? Right? Because there's a bunch of different things you could do. If that was your goal, I always talk about the three things we need. We always talk about productivity in this space. And I'm always saying, that we kind of know what gets you there: lower taxes, less regulation, cheaper energy, right? I mean, we kind of, and then it's just, exactly how do you change taxes? Exactly how do you get the regulation down? Politically, it's difficult, but the broad brush answer is relatively easy to say. It's hard to do, but easy to say. But I guess you could say there's 4 ways to try and achieve what Hastie is talking about: cheaper energy, lower taxes, less regulation, or an activist industry policy, a protectionist industry policy. Now, a lot of people are saying that's what he means, and maybe that is what he means. But just to start with, if the goal is more industry, if the goal is more manufacturing, great, let's fix our energy prices. I mean, that seems like a place of crossover. If there is a fight on the right, this seems a place where the ascended new right can agree, because we can all agree that we should be getting the energy prices down, giving up on the boondoggles of our renewable, unreliable energy friends and just focusing on cheaper energy. And that would actually help achieve some of what we're going for here. It wouldn't necessarily guarantee that we start making Commodores again, but there would be alignment on that side. So the first issue is like, what do you mean? What exactly is the policy? Because there could be alignment. And I don't want to say we disagree yet until I actually hear what the policy is. So thoughts on that part?
Yeah, but this is the other fight on the right. So if they say, well, let's talk about energy policy, then they're going to have a debate internally about energy policy. And this is what's essentially tearing the Liberal and National parties apart at the moment. And this was another, I didn't go to this session because there was a clash with something Peter Tulip was doing on heritage. But one of the sessions at Concilium was essentially a coalition conversation on energy. And Aidan Morrison emceed this conversation between Matt Canavan and James Patterson. And I sort of knew what both of them would be saying, where they'd be coming from, so that I'll go and listen to Peter. But basically, they're having this debate internally because there are people like Andrew Bragg who are adamant that they can't do anything to abandon net zero, or they'll just lose all of the votes in the inner city, or that they'll have no hope of ever getting those teal seats, and they might lose some more in of their traditional constituencies. But then there are others like say, well, Canavan, let's face reality, we're never going to hit this net zero, and it's causing all of these problems today, including the issues with Tomago, the smelter. Where is it? In around Newcastle, which can't get cheap enough power to keep operating. So these issues are affecting them today. It's a whole world of pain for the coalition at the moment on those issues. But I agree with you on energy. Let's do something about that. Let's get our IR policies right. So we've got competitive labour force. There are a whole bunch of things I think we can do that are going to be preferable to trying to recreate a car industry through subsidies or tariffs. I don't think that's the right way.
Well, I think the point that comes out from what you were saying there is, when I say there's a fight for the soul of the centre right, I don't think it's a fight with just two sides. I think there is the establishment right, which is the very careful, steady as she goes, keep keep one eye, keep two eyes on the opinion polls, and have somewhere in the back of your head that you used to be a right winger. All right, so that's the very careful establishment right, which are going to push back against the idea of shifting an energy policy just towards cheap prices. But then you've got this shift, I think it's fair to say, around the world that's on towards the new right. But I guess my point there is that the new right isn't one fixed thing yet either. So you've got the old establishment, a shift to the new right, but what exactly does that mean? Does that mean just a shift back to deregulated tax cutting cheap energy? Or does it mean a shift back to probably higher taxes to pay for the subsidies, and higher taxes because tariffs are higher taxes, which is, they're both very different visions from the establishment right. But they're also quite different visions from each other. And if someone says, I just want a better industry policy and more manufacturing, well, that's what I would say when I say cheaper energy, cut taxes, deregulate. That's going to get you some of that outcome. But that's also what the Hasties would say, or the Dan Ryans, Dan, if you're out there, would say when they're talking about a protectionist industry policy, or Jared Rennick, I think, is on that side as well. So it's a three-way fight. And you're right that the establishment will push back against cheap energy. But I'm just saying, to start with, if Hastie says, I want more manufacturing, well, it could be that the small government new right and the big government new right, we both want that. The devil's in the details. So maybe it's time to then move on to what those details may be. If it's not just cheap energy, which we're all in furious agreement on, at least in this podcast and probably in the new right. If it's not that, if it's going to be tariffs, then I think a few things to say there. This is when I start to get more negative, right? So up until now, they're politically ascendant and the goal could be good. But there's a couple of things. I just don't think it will work on its own terms. So there's a few things to consider. If the goal is, it kind of depends what the goal is, right? So there's several possible goals. Let's say we're just doing protectionism now, like activist industry policy and sort of protectionism, tariffs and subsidies and things like that. It depends what the goal is. And I'll just start with a couple of potentially legitimate goals where you could do some protection, I think, that it could make sense in some sort of context. But you need to know what the justification is. So one potential justification is revenue. Tariffs raise revenue. And we've discussed this before. Every tax, when you introduce it, if you introduce it at a low enough level, it doesn't cause too much damage, right? So you could make the case that, well, tariffs are like 0 or 5% in Australia. Our income tax, is up to 47%, and the EMTRs are above 80%. You could make the case that maybe bumping up our tariffs a little and cutting our income taxes would actually raise revenue in a less costly way. So if that's the argument, then I think very reasonable people could battle that out, a battle of graphs and elasticities to work out where that exact balance is. So I think that is a credible argument. I give credit to that. The other credible argument, I think, is, and this is what a lot of people are saying lately, is the security argument.
Yes.
But it's very important to understand what the consequence of each of those are. If the tariff argument is about revenue, It does not mean you have 100% tariffs. That's incoherent on the basis. If the goal is revenue, then we're talking about bumping it up from like 0 to 10%. That's what would make sense in the revenue argument. And if the goal is security, then autarky makes no sense here. If the goal is security and we are envisaging a future world where literally every other country in the world is against us, we've already lost, right? We're already lost. It's pointless preparing for that war, right? Clearly, we're going to have allies in the world. We're going to have friends, and we're going to have people, I don't want to call them enemies, but maybe people who are less friendly or less reliable. And the legitimate security argument is we need to make sure we are not over-reliant on unreliable partners. And I think that is a very good argument, right? But that's what the argument is there. It's not for we must produce everything in Australia. Because if we were producing some things in New Zealand and trading with them, that would not hurt our security. Realistically, if we're trading with America and Canada, that does not hurt our security. But if we are over-reliant to the point where we get 90% or 100% of crucial inputs from a country that we may well have a worse relationship with in the future and not be able to trade with, that is a security risk. That is a genuine risk, and mitigating that risk makes a lot of sense. But note, the consequence there isn't just cutting off trade. It is balancing your trading partners, right? The consequence of that, the implication of this argument, the security argument, is let's make sure we're not overly reliant on, I mean, obviously the elephant in the room here is China. So diversify your trading partners, China, Vietnam, Philippines, India, maybe bring some stuff back to Australia, but it's not a blanket anti-trade proposal, because having stronger ties with those countries that would be allies in a future conflict is probably a better way to enhance your security. So those are the two legitimate arguments, right? The revenue argument and the security argument, but neither of them lead to this overwhelming industry policy that some of our friends on the NatCon right push for. So I think we can say that those two reasons aren't their only reasons. And so this is where you go to how to stop there and on the revenue and security part first, and then I'll come back to the arguments that I think are behind some of the motivation, which I think aren't credible arguments. But we'll start with revenue and security. What did you think of those?
Oh, yep. I mean, I agree with you on revenue. I mean, low tariffs have, there aren't a lot of the level of distortion is pretty low. That's right, because if you double the tax rate, you quadruple the economic cost of it. There's that relationship. So at very low rates, they don't really make much of a difference. So I think that's reasonable. On the economic security, the national security issue, like this is a real, this is a tough one. And this is why I think Richard Holden nailed it when he had that great column in the AFR after the Glencore copper smelter bailout was announced. So I think it's 600 million or something. And that one of the justifications for that was national security and economic resilience. And Richard wrote a good piece saying, well, if we're going to have, I think it was Richard, it might have been Quiggin, but I think they both were saying similar things, that if we're going to have this as a justification.
Those are two very different names in economics.
But actually, I mean, Quiggin's been saying, Quiggin does say he's been saying some good stuff on a lot of these issues. So, full credit to him, along with Richard Holden. They're saying that, if we're going to start doing this and having national security as a justification, we should have a framework for it, right? You just can't apply this to everything, or everything will become national security. And we'll just be bailing out multiple industries and, having to have higher taxes to be able to pay for it, to try and compensate for the higher energy costs. It's just going to be, it's not a recipe for economic strength. But we need to have a real framework and look at, well, what is the legitimate national security issue here? And can we do this another way? I mean, like you mentioned, there are other countries. So, like, is it the case that we need to have this particular smelter in Australia, or is there an ally who has that smelter that we can rely on in the future? It's that sort of thing. The other thing I'm wondering too is whether it's all of our concern about China. I mean, how much of this has just been a beat up? We've got Donald Trump. I mean, Trump's been over talking with President Xi Jinping, being great mates with him and, trying to, patch up the relationship. I mean, Trump doesn't want to have a war with China. He's not that mad. And I think he could actually push back against a lot of the China hawks. So one thing I've noticed, and I've had a few of these people on my podcast over the years, there are people in the national security establishment, or in that sort of, what do you call it, that world, the think tank world that deals with national security, who think, they actually see things in these, the America and China, there's this Thucydides trap they talk about. They're bound to come into conflict because they're rival powers or rival great powers. But I mean, we have the ability to avoid that. We have the ability to do, to actually do deals, to live in peace with China and to trade and be prosperous. That's the path I'd prefer, rather than, thinking, oh, well, naturally we're headed for conflict with them.
Yeah, I got to say, I think over the last 250 years, they've identified 28 examples of potential Thucydides traps, 24 of which ended in war. And I think at least two of those other four, like one of those other four, was the Cold War, which wasn't particularly pleasant. So that's, I think that Thucydides trap is something to be scared about. I think it is legitimate to be worried about over-reliance on any non-close partner that you can't rely on. And I think I don't think China's an enemy or an antagonist that we need to fight. At least I can't see that at the moment. But I don't think they are reliably going to be good friends regardless of the power balance. And if they have an excessive power balance over Australia, I think that is a dangerous place to be geopolitically. I think we geopolitically want to avoid that over-reliance on potentially unreliable trading partners. So I do think that's a legitimate concern. But if that's the concern, notice you could say that's my concern, therefore protectionism, tariff, subsidies, which is a conclusion that people often run to first and then try to work out their reason for second. But if that's your genuine concern, then it equally leads to, well, let's have a free trade agreement with Vietnam. Right? I mean, that's a just as equally logical thing to say. If the concern genuinely is over-reliance on potentially unreliable partners, diversify your reliance. That's the most obvious thing to do. And if you have it all done in Australia, that's not a diversified supply chain, right? That's all in one place for one enemy to bomb. So a diversified supply chain is actually the best way of ensuring sort of long-term economic and geopolitical security. And that could involve more trade in some places and less trade in other places, right? I think we should be open to the fact that sometimes the proponents of protectionism, they might be legitimately have found a place where security is at play, and we have to be open to, maybe we'll run into some of those and we have to say, yes, sure, that makes sense. I'm not ruling it all out a priori. I'm saying it's a legitimate reason. But I do think that, as I said before, sometimes you find people who start with the idea that they want industry policy and tariffs and subsidies. And then they say, wait, what's a good argument? Security. And then everything, like you say, everything becomes security.
Yeah.
But if you start with security as the issue, then roll out what the potential arguments are, then I think that's a conversation worth having. But anyway, let's go to the other arguments that I suspect are sitting below the surface. For some people, and this is the kind of Trumpian argument, it's good for the economy. And I think that's the problem with that is it may well play well politically. I think it's transparently not true, at least for an economy smaller than America. See, the issue you get, and it's quite easy to show this at the macro level. Let me step back and put my sort of lecturer hat on. The sentence I'm about to say, if you're a protectionist, you'll disagree with it, but wait, it doesn't mean what you think it means. Firstly, trade is good. Note, before you say, no, I disagree, no, we need to have protection. I didn't say international trade. When you exchange your labor with your employer, that is trade, that is good. If you couldn't do that, you would have to live under autarky and build your house yourself. Obviously, that trade is good. If you run a business, it's because you're selling something, that trade is good. Being able to buy things from the Australian manufacturers, you want Australian manufacturing to grow, they'll sell something to you. There's trade there. So trade is inherently good. The more different people you can trade with, the more benefits of trade you can get. And what this does, once you realize that part of the puzzle, it shows why Australia and America are in quite different situations. Trade is good. Americans already have 350 million people to trade with.
Yes.
Right? If they stop trading with the world, they have a lot of people with a lot of very different people across a very big continent, right? New Hampshire is very different to Seattle, which is very different to New Mexico. And I know I picked one city in 2 states, but you get what I'm saying there, right? Like they've already got a lot of gains from trade domestically. Smaller countries cannot take that attitude, or at least not without suffering much higher economic costs, right? So Australia is economically and demographically a much smaller country than America. The costs that would come to us from going down the tariff and subsidies route, firstly, the tariffs route, if we rely on it too much, it's just obviously going to put up prices. I know some people try to say, oh, no, it's the foreigners who pay for it. But obviously, they're not going to keep paying for it unless the consumer pays more for something. And we are living in what many people think of as a cost of living crisis, where prices have already gone up way too much over the last 6 years. And the solution is to have the prices go up more. It's a cost, right? It's self-evidently a cost. You can say, well, it doesn't have to be tariffs. It could be subsidies. Paid for how? Right? The subsidies are either going to be paid for by increasing taxes. Taxes are already too high. Taking out debt. Debt is already too high. Or printing money, causing inflation, causing the cost of living crisis, which is already too high. Right? So this is the reason subsidies went down previously. Both Liberal and Labor looked at their budgets and went, oh, well, look, runaway spending on pensions, but we can't touch that. We'll get voted out. Runaway spending on health, but we can't touch that. We'll get voted out. Runaway spending on sort of foreign corporations who have set up a hub in Australia. Well, I guess we could cut subsidies to sort of large American multinational companies. That might work politically, which is why they were able to wind back the subsidies on car manufacturers previously, which were mostly foreign owned. So it is unambiguously costly for our economy to introduce high levels of tariffs and subsidies. However, some of the more honest people, our more honest interlocutors on this issue would respond. Gene and I believe some of them did, saying, yes, this would be bad for the economy, but it's worth it. Well, then it's like worth it to what end, right? So some of our more lefty friends would say, well, it's worth it for the environment. That argument, I think we can put a pin in that, right? It's the countries. I don't think there's any evidence that protectionism helps the environment. And I wrote a book on that many years ago but greening farm subsidies, it's called. But anyway, we'll put that aside because that's probably not most of the people on the right are worried about. I think what a lot of people would say is jobs, right? Yes. Good, solid, working class jobs. And look, I have a lot of sympathy with what I think is motivating that sentence, right? I think that a job for many people is what gives them a sense of meaning. A sense of meaning is important. Lack of meaning, I think, is one of the big problems going on in the Western world at the moment. We've got a decline in family, that gives meaning. We've got a decline in church attendance, that gives meaning. We've got a decline in just sort of stable, long-term fulfilling jobs, that gives meaning. And I think this is a crisis. I think this is a significant problem. And it's a problem that many people on the new right are worried about. And I think they are correct to be worried about. And they get the sense that the laissez-faire right, the establishment right, the libertarian right, or whatever you want to call it, and the establishment right is not the libertarian right. I'll just point that out. Libertarians do not run this country. But they feel like we are indifferent to this sort of cultural and social and communitarian critique. And maybe some people are, but I am not. I am very interested. I am very persuaded that critique matters. Here's the problem. I see no evidence that any policy that you could imagine, explain to me where the policy is going to bring these jobs back. Overwhelming number of job losses in manufacturing have been caused by automation. Yeah. Bringing back a bunch of very sophisticated robots to build cars in Australia with 3 people with master's degrees in engineering pressing a button, that is not bringing back working class jobs. It's bringing back some sort of fancy engineering jobs and only a handful of them, and then huge factories full of robots. And so I'm very sympathetic with the goal of let's bring back meaningful work if you could find some magical way of doing it. Correct me if I'm wrong, or someone help me out for the people who disagree at home. How is this actually going to achieve that end? I mean, I understand saying I want the end. Great, I want the end. Show me how the policy is going to achieve the end. And I would be very interested. I'd be very open-minded. But I just can't see it at the moment. So what's your take on that, Mr. Gene?
Yes. I mean, that's what I would have been. That's what I was thinking too. I mean, it's it's hard to see how. I mean, we can't go back to the 60s where we had, I don't know, however many thousands of people worked in the different, car factories. I mean, actually, we would have. I mean, manufacturing. I think there were more people employed in manufacturing 50 years ago, or maybe proportionally, certainly there were like 3 or 4 times. But I think basically we have fewer people working in manufacturing now than we did 20 years ago. So it's just been on a downward trend, the number of people employed in manufacturing. I think we're over 1 million at one stage, but we're well below that now. And yeah, I think a lot of that is associated with automation. It's not as if we don't make things, but we make things that are highly specialized or they're niche. We've got a particular advantage, or the inputs are located close by, and we've got lots of them, like agricultural commodities, and then they go into food manufacturing. So we're very, we're good at that sort of thing, and wine making. But yeah, I mean, we're not going to be. I can't see us being competitive in mass manufacturing of cars anymore, although we do have a very vibrant aftermarket segment. I don't know if you've seen that at all, John, but that shows how we're very good at converting the American cars that come in to right-hand drive, and adding extra features onto them. So that we do have some advantages, but it's not going to be. It's not manufacturing like it was in the 60s or 70s. I don't think we'll have that back again.
Yeah, well, I don't think anywhere is because of that automation. No. And by the way, look, I think one of my concerns with this debate is I think it's, for a lot of people, it has been driven by this sense of a lack of meaning and wanting to rediscover some of that meaning through bringing back meaningful jobs. And I just think that discussion, that topic, is so important. I hope it doesn't get hijacked with this sort of simple little banner to wave saying tariffs, which then won't work, and we're left with the same problem and lower levels of productivity and lower incomes because of it. So a worse economy and a false solution to a very real problem that nobody is trying to address because we've got a fake solution already, which makes people think they don't need to address it. And so much of the rebuttal from the NatCon side against us is that we don't take seriously this very important, in my opinion, sort of cultural, social meaning problem. I think in my case, at least, that's the exact opposite of the truth. I think is very little more important to be talking about. But someone explain to me how we get from here to there. So, I mean, if the issue is meaning as well, the other thing to factor in the sort of the economic cost that people say, I'm willing to accept these economic costs if it gives us a stronger community and better jobs. But firstly, you're not getting the jobs, you're getting a bunch of robots doing the jobs, and then you are getting the economic cost. And people think economic cost, that means there's a graph on TV that went the wrong way, right? The graph went down, I need to make the graph go up. Who cares, right? I'm living a life here. People are lacking meaning and lacking community and killing themselves and taking SSRIs until they go crazy. And you're talking about a graph on TV. I get all that. That's a good critique. But I don't care about the graph on TV. I care about the fact that if productivity stays low, real incomes will go down. The cost of living crisis is caused by low productivity. Right? This is not just a graph on TV. This is the real incomes, your ability to keep affording things. If you're feeling like you're working your guts out and you're not getting ahead, and you feel like you're going backwards and you get a 3% raise, but your bills went up by 5%, if you feel like that, for a good reason. That is happening, right? And this is a problem. This is a very real problem, and it can only be fixed by higher productivity, as we talk about forever on this show. And this would literally lower productivity while pretending to solve an extremely important issue, which we wouldn't be talking about properly because we've got a fake solution. So that's what I worry about here. And maybe we should reach out to some of our interlocutors who disagree. Some of the people, and you can't say their names, and you shouldn't, from Concilium, but maybe some of those people, you could reach out personally and ask them if they'd like to come here and chat with us and our audience about this issue.
Well, I think we should talk to Dan. We haven't chatted with Dan Ryan yet, have we? I mean, I'm sure Dan would be up for a chat. Dan wasn't at Concilium, but I'm sure he'd be up for a chat on these issues. I think he'd be good to speak with. I think he'd be...
I think we've spoken to him, or at least I think I've spoken to at one stage, but I mean, we should do that. But he won't be the only one. I mean, there's a lot of people floating around the right now who are having these thoughts.
Yes.
And they are, I think, motivated by very reasonable concerns. But maybe we need to talk them out a bit more. Before. By the way, there's one other potential reason to have this sort of tariffs and protection, which I don't think is overly relevant in Australia, but it's relevant if you're looking in America, and that is the issue of sort of geopolitical leverage. And that's what I think is a lot of what's going on with Trump. You say, that's 100% tariff. Let's talk. All right, now I've taken it down, but you've given me something else I want. And I think that makes sense when you're a big country. It makes no sense for Australia, right? So that's anyone who looks at that and is trying to imitate America's reasons to apply it to Australia. I guess we could use that sort of leverage against Tuvalu. And I don't know what it is we're exactly trying to get from Tuvalu, but we could try that. It would probably backfire because China would just give them double the aid and then put Tuvalu in the China column in the South Pacific. But sorry, anyway, I'm just raising that because that is another category of argument, but I'm not sure if it applies to Australia. Anyway, we have taken up a lot of time talking about this. It is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while. And I think this broader discussion of the direction of the new right is something that we should come back to because if the center right gets that wrong, it could be quite damaging for this country. And if it gets it right, it could be quite a good thing for this country. So it's worth having that public debate.
Well, I mean, it could actually be the end of what you call the center right or the mainstream. I mean, this could be the end. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Tom Switzer has a different view because Tom sees these things as cyclical. But essentially, you look at the Liberal Party at the moment, and you would say that, I mean, they're at an existential. It's an existential issue for them. I mean, they could actually. This could be the end of them, as it could be the end of the Conservatives, the Tories in the UK. And this is something that Andrew Neil was saying in his remarks. He gave a talk at Concilium. I don't think that's covered by the Chatham House rule because they'll publish that at some stage. But he basically gave a talk about how all the energy on the right in the UK at the moment is with reform. And, reform's basically going to become Farage will be PM at this stage. I mean, Labor will get destroyed. The Tory party will be wiped out. You could see something, I don't know if you'll see something similar in Australia. You may see One Nation and the National Party led by Matt Canavan, say, merging and forming an opposition to Labor, which is now sort of basically embraced the Green. It's sort of aligned with the Greens. It's not really old school Labor anymore. It's more of a Green Party, and I think that's going to be the big conflict in the coming decades.
Yeah, I don't think we're there in Australia yet. I think it could happen, but for it to happen, I think it would require either a Barnaby Joyce or a Matt Canavan to be leading it. And that we're not there yet. But it's fascinating to watch what's happening in England play out before us because it does seem like the Tories could be over there unless there's a grand merger, which I also half suspect that might be where that ends up, the grand merger between Reform and the Tories. But anyway, that's inside baseball. Let's do a session on that. Let's bring that in as a topic coming forward. What is it going to look like? But before we run out of time, let's quickly touch on the other two topics we wanted to get to in the last 10 minutes. We'll play the lightning round. All right.
Well, I should talk about the inflation numbers that came out yesterday because essentially this is making us wonder whether, has the RBA cut too much? I mean, there was talk of a potential rate cut next week on Melbourne Cup Day. That's all gone now because CPI inflation through the year came in at 3.2%. That's the headline rate. The core inflation rate, which is what everyone, what the RBA is concerned about, came in at 3%. This trimmed mean, and so essentially at the top of the target band, 2 to 3%, and essentially that rules out rate cuts, and it makes you wonder. Well, will the next move be up, and when will it be up? One thing that is very concerning is that on a quarterly basis, that trimmed mean, that core inflation figure, is around 1%, which on an annual basis, if you annualize the quarterly number, so more essentially multiplying it by 4 roughly, then you get, that's 4%. So that's well above, that would be well above the target band if that's replicated in coming quarters. So essentially, it looks like, I mean, who knows? I get the RBA is going to be hoping that, and the Treasury, particularly Jim Chalmers, because this goes to the whole his legacy, they'll be hoping, well, this is just an odd or a rogue result. It's just this quarter. The headline CPI is up partly because the energy subsidies are coming off, the electricity subsidies. But what will be concerning and having them worried is that underlying, that core inflation result, which takes out those volatile items, including energy, and it's still showing inflation may not be anchored within the target band after all, and the RBA may have egg on its face. It may have cut too much. So yeah, very all very interesting, and yeah, I think they'll be very worried in Martin Place about this.
Yeah, especially as you say, the quarterly number being 1, because annualize that, you times it by 4%. That is you can't quite do that, of course, but that's the scary part of this, because 3% is technically within the 2 to 3% range. So if they were sort of bouncing around between 2.5% to 3%, that might not spook them too much. But the trajectory is scary. So it does. Well, I haven't looked at what the markets have factored in yet, but I would imagine no change is now the favorite.
Yeah, basically. So yes, all very good. Yeah, I mean, it'll be very concerning for Chalmers, because he thought he'd nailed it. He thought we had this immaculate disinflation in Australia. We managed to get inflation down without having a big increase in unemployment, and now it's that may not be the case. And the commentators are already starting to say, well, this is related to the the ongoing growth of government spending. That's adding to demand. That's adding to price pressures. So yeah, really, who knows? As they say, a week's a long time in politics, isn't it? And so it could be the case that, I mean, everyone's sort of getting stuck into the opposition at the moment, saying, aren't you hopeless? You can't agree on anything, and you're a rabble. But it could be the case that the government is soon on the back foot over the economy. So all very fascinating.
Well, yeah, one of the interesting tidbits here of the data. So we've got unemployment going up and inflation going up. Now, of course, Phillips' curve says that it's not supposed to work like that, but Phillips' curve is bunk. Throw it in the bin. But anyway, we've got unemployment going up and inflation going up. But at the same time, we've just come out of recession. Whereas for the last 3 or 4 years, the country has been mostly in a recession, per capita recession, but that's the only one that matters. We've been in a recession while unemployment's been low and inflation has been coming down. So the world seems to have gone mad with these data points. But look, if we continue the trend of sort of unemployment ticking up and inflation ticking up, that is going to put the government and probably the RBA in an insidious bind. I mean, the RBA should just increase rates to get inflation under control, because that is, in my opinion, their primary remit and what they should focus on. But it puts the government in a very tricky situation. And I don't know if they have the wherewithal to work their way out.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point, John. It may well be the optimal policy move for the RBA to increase the cash rate next week. I mean, who knows? I mean, that maybe they have got it wrong, but they won't do that for reputational reasons. There's no way they'd even contemplate that, because it'd just be so embarrassing for them. I mean, maybe they'd rationalize it by saying, oh, if we did that, no one would have any trust in our monetary policy anymore. We'd look like fools, because no one expected, or I mean, maybe some people were expecting it, but it does really raise questions about whether monetary policy has our monetary policy settings over the last few months.
Yeah, I think they could reasonably make the case that they wanted to wait for another data point.
Yeah. Yes.
Like I think they need to start considering it now, depending what
Yeah.
comes in next. But it's only just touched 3. It's underlying is what I'll
Yeah.
focus in, not the headline. It's only just touched 3. They could reasonably make the case. I mean, I think, as we've discussed before, I think 3% is too high as a target, right? So I would be raising interest rates at this point, but I wouldn't have lowered them at this to this degree. So this isn't. I'm not saying what a Humphreys RBA would do, but I'm saying from judging them based on their own criteria, I think they could say they want another data point before they make another move now.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so that's inflation. Big news for us. The other news I wanted to touch on was about Argentina. So we had the elections a few days ago, and Milei's party were re-elected. They got back in, or they it was a win for them, and that's been interpreted positively by the markets. So I've got the exchange rate for Argentina. So that's the Argentinian peso versus the US dollar. Now that's the number of pesos per $1 US. So as it goes higher, it gets worse for them. So essentially what's happened since because of all of the high inflation, I mean, their peso's been devalued over time, and they've gradually they've been allowing it to devalue. There was a big step change at the end of 2023 when Milei got in, and then they devalued in one significant amount in one go, and then since then they've sort of been letting it devalue sort of gradually and trying to keep it within a particular range. And what we saw after Milei, when they had that positive election news, the peso improved by about 10%. So that's toward the end of the time series there. You'll see toward the right axis, there's a significant drop down to, I think that's just under 1,400 to, I should put my glasses on, I may have the number wrong, but basically it improved by about 10%, but then it's bounced back partly. So that's been reversed a bit, and that's because now people are thinking, well, now that that the markets were relieved that Milei got back in because he could continue with his reform agenda and his getting the economy back on track, things under control, inflation under control. It's been coming down, but it's still high. Now there's speculation that he will devalue, or basically let the peso float freely. So there's speculation about that, and so therefore the peso some of the gains were significantly reversed. So yeah, all very fascinating. It just goes to show the role of expectations in determining exchange rates and market outcomes. And now what everyone's looking for is what's Milei going to do with the exchange rate? They've been getting support from the US. That people have called it a bailout. It's more like a loan. So there's been a lending or a swap facility, so they can get access to US dollars. There's also a loan facility of 20 billion US. So it's not. You could say it's a bailout, but it probably has some justification, given that Argentina is an important country in South America. And I think it's good that Milei is trying to get things back on track after they've had so many decades of poor policy. I can't remember how many default times Argentina's defaulted on its debt, or how many hyperinflations it's had during that period. But it's just a perpetual sinner in terms of economic policy, and so I think it's good that the Americans are providing. They're trying to provide some support in a limited way, in a way that where it isn't, where they will eventually get the money back, or they'll get most of it back. So yep, we'll wait and see how that all rolls out. So have you been following Argentina, John?
I was not as closely as some of my friends. We should invite John Ruddock or some of the others that have been very interested in Argentina on to have a chat about it at some stage. But I was watching their election come in quite closely. So this was their equivalent of the midterms. If anyone follows American politics, this was basically the Argentinian midterms. Javier Milei, the president, wasn't up for re-election, but half of the parliament was up for re-election. Half of their lower house and 1/3 of their Senate, 1/3 of their upper house was up for election. When Milei won, he won the presidency, but of course, not everyone was up for election in the Congress, in their parliament. And so his party has always been in a minority in parliament. So what Milei's been able to get done is only from the presidential offices. He hasn't really been able to have control of parliament. He wasn't even I believe, wasn't even the second biggest party. After he won the presidency, he basically... the biggest party remained like their center left, or what they might call that, or we could call the hard left. But anyway, their standard left wing party remained the biggest party. Their standard right wing party, I think, remained the second biggest party. And Milei's sort of libertarian party came up there and got a very close third. But I mean, that's not enough to pass legislation. And their establishment right wing party has ended up playing very well with Milei, right? They've teamed up. And in this election, they basically ran as one, or the mainstream right didn't run candidates and just said, go and vote for Milei's mob. And that worked. In this election, they won a majority of seats in the lower that were up for election, right? Not all the seats were up for election, but 127 were up for election, and they won 64, which is just as the bare majority. But that's, if he does that again in 2 years' time, he's got control of Congress. And what this means now is, it used to be that to pass anything through Congress, Milei needed his own Libertarian Party plus the establishment right, which in Argentina became possible because when the establishment right saw the success of Milei, they started to actually fall in line a little bit with his agenda.
Yeah.
But then there was also a big crossbench, a mishmash of everybody and his uncle. And so that has been frustrating Milei's goals to quite some degree over the last 2 years. It now looks like the Libertarian Party plus the establishment right might be able to pass more stuff through Parliament. So this is going to be interesting. To what degree does this free up Milei and his party to actually instantiate more of their libertarian agenda, the stuff that requires parliamentary approval? Hold on to your seats. It could get interesting. And that's on the politics side. As for the economics, of course, the big thing has been this bailout, or the swap, right? Would you say it could be called a loan? I guess people say concessionary loans is the type of bailout.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I agree.
It really depends. You could potentially make an economic argument for it depending on what the terms are of the agreement. Now, I suspect the terms of the agreement are that it is very likely to be a concessionary, sort of a very friendly loan. Now, I haven't looked at the terms of the agreement. It is possible to frame a currency swap with terms that are structured in such a way that America could win. And I suspect they haven't done that. But if they had done that, then the issue here was this would be a bet on, are Milei's policies going to work? Because you make the bet now, then he introduces the policies, improves the country, and the swap pays off for you. That's theoretically possible. I wish that was true. I'd like that to be true. I haven't checked. I suspect it isn't. I suspect it's a concessionary loan, effectively. Now, then it comes down to, well, what would be the rationale for that? Well, geopolitics, obviously. If you believe that Milei's agenda is good or even less bad than Lula's agenda in Brazil, for instance, the Argentina, all of Latin America has quite a vibrant political culture of going back and forth between very radically different options, a socialist revolution one week, a fascist revolution the next week, and then some pseudo-communist followed by a military junta. So if Milei's movement fails, it's not like the alternative coming up is going to be a bed of roses for the US. So, for geopolitical reasons, you could understand why they might like to make an investment in a friend rather than an enemy. So I suspect it's geopolitical. Theoretically, it could be economic if the terms were right. But look, and as for whether this is going to pay off, this is it's been fascinating to watch, and it still will be fascinating to watch. what you need to remember is, of course, Milei isn't the dictator. So this isn't just a referendum on is Milei correct. It's politics is the art of what making the sausage, I think, is the old saying. It's it's going to end up being some compromise mishmash. Is the compromise mishmash going to end up being good enough to get Argentina back on track? That's the relevant question, and I don't think we've got the answer yet. It's pointing in the right direction. Like you said before, inflation's gone down from about 300% down to about 30%.
Yep.
So 300 to 30, that's a great improvement. But of course, if you're used to inflation levels that we're used to, 30% is still quite eye-watering. And they'll need to get that down to, if they want to be able to float the currency, they'll need to get that inflation down to at least under 10%. Otherwise, the floating the currency is going to not look very pretty.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Very good.
Yes, Argentina. Keep an eye on it. A lot of people in Australia don't follow Argentinian politics because, of course, they don't. Because why would they? And I mean, that's entirely normal. I'm not suggesting you follow it because Argentina is the most important country in the world, but there are very few examples in the world where you have a self-described anarcho-capitalist, which, if you don't know what that means, it's the most radical form of libertarian. Becomes the president of a country with, 40 million people, what used to be one of the richest countries in the world. And the second biggest economy in Latin America, South America at least.
Well, so and that's why I always find it fascinating, because isn't there that factoid? I read this somewhere. I don't know whether it was in one of Angus Madison's books, but basically Argentina and Australia at the beginning of the 20th century were the two of the wealthiest countries in the world in per capita terms. We had the gold rush in the late 19th century. So that was one of the reasons. But yet we've sort of continued growing or we've sort of stayed up in that top league of nations. But then Argentina's just slid down because of the, heavy interventionist, populist, socialist policies of Perón and people who are inspired by him in that party, whatever that Peronist party is. And it's just extraordinary. I mean, that's a path that, I mean, we thankfully didn't. I mean, we've had silly policies in the past, but we never went down that route or to that extreme. And so we've managed to maintain a very high standard of living. And yet they've, just suffered immensely over the last 100 years or so.
Yes, I believe that's right, that Australia and Argentina were the two richest, and we've gone very different paths. I mean, it's interesting to note what failed in a lot of Latin America, because it's not just an Argentinian story, it's a Latin American story. Latin America was quite a rich corner of the world. Argentina was like the jewel in the crown, but it was quite a productive area going back 120 years. And across the area there wasn't a communist takeover. There wasn't, you could kind of call it socialist in a way, but what it really was is profligate spending. And which is why I think Latin America is one of the most important lessons of economic history that we could be looking at when in Australia and across Europe right now, where we keep going down this path of we'll just spend a little bit more and a little bit more. I know we can't afford it, but we could just spend a little bit more. And it's kind of like the frog in boiling water. And you never had a socialist revolution. Like there wasn't a vanguard and a group of Leninists that stormed the barricades. Just little by little, you spent a little bit more each time. Just one more NBN over here, one more sort of nationalized insurance company over there. And very slowly, one election at a time, one election bribe, one election handout at a time, it became unsustainable and then collapsed. And of course, once it becomes unsustainable, once the fiscal position becomes unsustainable, the most obvious thing for a government to do the best thing to do is get their fiscal house in order. Right? That's what they should do. That's what Malay's done. I mean, it's actually running a budget surplus now. But the easiest thing to do, of course, is to just print a little bit more money. And so nearly every one of these sort of periods of profligate government spending has been followed by runaway inflation. And then it's a runaway inflation building on a debt trap, means you've got like a financial crisis and an inflationary crisis at the same time. They try to hold on as long as they can. The entire economy goes down the toilet. They rebuild, don't learn the lessons, and start overspending again, which is why it's so important to avoid the temptation of overspending in the first place. And it is a lesson that we need to look at. If we look at the trajectory Australia is on, it can be a confronting thing to say, explain to me why we're not on the same trajectory. And the answer is, well, I assume there's going to be a very brave politician that comes up soon and convinces the public to accept lower spending. I hope so. But, kumbaya, my brother. It's I hope that happens. But if it doesn't...
I mean, we've had some luck because of, essentially China, the growth of China in the 90s and, the emergence in the early 2000s, huge demand for iron ore and for coal and for other commodities. And we've been, that's sort of covered up, that's made up for a lot of, or compensated for a lot of sins. Yes.
Well, I also think the Anglosphere benefited from... I would give a lot of the credit to Milton Friedman and his cohort, having created an intellectual revolution which rippled through the intelligentsia, got into the departments, and eventually showed up in the form of Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in America, and Hawke Keating in Australia. So we benefited from that little intellectual pushback for a few decades that slightly slowed the rot. But I think the trajectory is still there. We just they did a very credible and good thing, which is slowed down that descent into madness. But I can't see us changing paths just yet. Just walking down that same bad path slightly slower. So on that depressing note,
yes,
and for that, of course, the solution to the inflation problem earlier, the solution to unemployment going up, as always, as we're used to, probably bored of us saying, we need higher productivity in Australia. And the one thing you can guarantee would get us higher productivity, tariffs and subsidies. But anyway, so that last comment may have contained traces of peanuts and sarcasm. But
indeed. Okay.
We've got over an hour 10, so I think we'll call that a wrap. For those listening at home, thank you for joining us. This is Death and Taxes, the podcast live stream of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I am one half of your host, John Humphreys, and over here is Jean Tunney. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again next week. And until then, stay safe, stay happy, stay free.